name is Molly Lewis, and today I'm going to be telling you about some work suggesting that a child's superordinate word knowledge can predict their longitudinal vocabulary growth. Learning a language requires learning the core vocabulary of that language. But across children, there's lots of variability in learning trajectories. This is a figure from the Word Bank project showing children's productive vocabulary as measured from parent report checklists as a function of age, where the colors showed trajectories for different quantiles of children, highlighting the really high degree of variability across children in the rate at which they learn new words. Researchers have hypothesized lots of sources of variability for these trajectories, one source being differences in language input, both in quality and quantity. Another source being children's ability to use contextual factors in the physical environment to constrain the hypothesis space about word meanings. So children's ability, for example, to use eye gaze, their ability to use other objects in the context to constrain word meaning, allowing them to use strategies like cross-situational learning or mutual exclusivity. But there's a third set of factors that might explain some of the variability in word learning trajectories, what I'm going to call language internal factors. One example of these language internal factors is syntactic bootstrapping, children's ability to use syntax of a sentence to constrain hypotheses about a word's meaning. Another is network structure. So this literature has shown that properties of a child's vocabulary network, both in terms of semantic and phonological connections, can predict which words they're going to learn later on. And there's a third one that I'm going to focus on today, which is particular words. That is, whether particular words might help a child learn new words down the road. I'm going to call these seed words. And the question is whether a child's earlier knowledge of these sort of seed words might facilitate learning of new words later on. You might ask what sort of characterizes these seed words, and here we're going to focus on one particular property of words, a property that I'm going to call a word's generality, or the extent to which it refers to a superordinate meaning. Words that are high on this dimension are words like animal, color, move. These are very general, superordinate words. Knowing these general terms, these sort of superordinate seed words, might facilitate word learning for a few different reasons. So one is they might just motivate children to seek out subordinate words that are semantically related. So if you know, for example, that color is a dimension that adults might talk about, that might facilitate you to learn subordinate words that are semantically related, like red and blue. Two, it might support inductive biases for forming robust semantic categories. So if you know, for example, that a pigeon and a dog are both under the category of animal, or could both be called animal, despite the fact that they look really different from each other, that might facilitate building a sort of more robust semantic category that might ultimately facilitate using inductive biases to learn more words in that semantic category. And third, it might support asking adults what something is called. So if you know the superordinate label for a dimension, you can ask adults questions like, what color is this? And that might support word learning. So in the current work, what we did was we hypothesized that knowing more general words of the sort that I've just described facilitates vocabulary growth, as measured by vocabulary checklists. In study one, we're going to measure word generality in a psychologically valid way. In study two, we're going to use word generality to predict vocabulary growth. And in study three, we're going to predict not only which kids are going to learn more words, but which new words they're going to learn. All right, so to quantify this idea of word generality, we used the ideas of hyponymy and hypernymy through the database called WordNet, which is a structured database of English concepts that are organized into various semantic relationships. So you could represent sort of a tidbit of this database like this, with various concepts that are linked in a structured way. In this framework, hyponymy is the number of links below a word or a word's children. So a word like animal would have a high hyponymy score because it has lots of links below it, or lots of children. Whereas a word like reptile would have a lower hyponymy score because it has fewer links below it. Hypernymy is a distinct but related measure, which is the number of links above a word, in other words, a word's parents. So here, a word like dog would have a high hypernymy score, whereas a word like animal would have a low hypernymy score because it doesn't have any parents. So what we did then was take words from the parent report checklist, the MCDI words and sentences form, and match them to words in WordNet for the set of words that were available. This was about 450 words from the MCDI. We then validated this measure from WordNet using explicit adult ratings of generality. The way we collected these was just by giving adults these various words and asking them to rate on a 5-point Likert scale, ranging from very specific to very general, how general these words were in their meanings. This led to very sensible responses. So here are some examples of words that were related low on generality. Some nouns were rocking chair, rooster. Nouns that were high in generality were nouns like animal, people, toy. For verbs, words that were related low were stop, tickle, meow, and words that were related high were think, get. Here's what the relationship between the human generality ratings and the WordNet estimates of generality. So first, here's what it looks like for eponymy. We see, as expected, a relationship between the two. They're correlated about 0.43. So words that are rated as highly general, like animals, tend to have low hyponymy scores. We also see the expected pattern for hypernymy. Words that have a rated highly general, like animal, tends to have a low hypernymy score. Furthermore, this holds for lexical, within lexical class. So I've colored here the words by their lexical class. Noun are in orange and verbs are in green. And you can see that within each of these subclasses, we see the same general trends. So taken together, our analyses suggest that word generality is a psychologically relevant property, and that these lexical database measures provide reasonably good estimates of generality. This is especially noteworthy considering that WordNet contains lots of words and lots of sentences that our participants are unlikely to know. Okay, so then in study 2, we use this word generality measure to predict children's vocabulary growth. We used a data set of MCDI administrations from 201 children that were collected longitudinally. So each child has about 7.6 administrations. The first and last administrations for each child were sort of roughly around 19 months and 26 months. Here's a visual representation of this data set, where on the y-axis I'm showing vocabulary size from the MCDI as a function of age, and I'm representing each child as a line and each administration as a point. For a small subset of these children, we have estimates of their IQ that were taken during the last administration of the MCDI. Okay, so our data looks something like this. For each child, we have a bunch of administrations of the MCDI at various time points. So what we did then was at each time point for each child, we measured two things critically. We measured their vocabulary generality as the mean hypernymy score of all known words at that administration of the MCDI, and the vocabulary growth as the number of words the child had learned since the previous administration. We then fit an additive mixed effect model predicting vocabulary growth at time point 2 with vocabulary generality from the previous time point. And we did that for every pair of time points for each child. We controlled in our model statistically for a number of other factors: change in age since previous time point, vocabulary at previous time point, and mean word frequency at previous time point. Here's what we found. Critically, we found that vocabulary generality was a strong predictor of vocabulary growth. I'm showing you on the right the model parameters from the model that I just described, where the key term is the vocabulary hypernymy at time -1, where we see that children who knew more general words at the previous time point tended to learn more words at the next time point. This holds when the hypernym is scaled by lexical class and by semantic category. like animals, clothing, food, etc. Furthermore, it holds when you control for a child's IQ score, for that subset of kids that we have IQ estimates, suggesting that some third factor isn't driving this relationship that we're observing. Okay, so study 2 provides evidence that children who know more general words at the previous time point learn more words at the next time point. But our hypothesis is a little bit more specific than that. It predicts that we should not only be able to predict which kids are going to learn more words, we should also be able to predict which new words they're going to learn. So in study 3, we ask, do children who know a particular more general word go on to learn more specific semantically related words? That is, does a child who knows animal, for example, go on to learn at a subsequent time point cat and zebra, which are subordinates of animal? Okay, so to do this, we identified the semantic coordinates of all the words on the MCDI using a word embedding model trained on a large corpus of English text. This figure shows a 2D projection of all the coordinates of the words on the MCDI, where the color corresponds to each word's hypernymy score. And the thing to note here is that these words form coherent clusters. So for example, we see in the bottom left a cluster of animals, and in the top right a cluster of vegetables. So here's the analysis that we did then. We took for each child for each time point all of the words they knew at a given level of hypernymy. So take, for example, the words animal and person. Suppose a child knew those words at time point 1. Then, at the subsequent time point for that child, we found all of the words at a lower level in the hierarchy, all the subordinates of those words that the child knew, and measured the distance between the previously known superordinates and the newly learned subordinates. But the prediction, of course, is the newly learned subordinates should be close to the previously known superordinates. We then compared this to an analysis where we randomly selected words that the kids knew at the previous time point from all levels of the hierarchy, and then compared those randomly selected words to the same subordinate words that we used in the target comparison. We quantified the similarity between these words using cosine distance. All right, so I'm collapsing here across different levels of hypernymy and different time points to show you an individual line for each child in our data set. And what we find is, as predicted, the target comparison it has a shorter cosine distance than in the control condition. In other words, children tended to learn specific words that were semantically closer to the more general words that they knew at the prior time point. So to wrap up then, we find that knowing more general nouns and verbs, or those that are higher up in the semantic hierarchy, predicts a faster rate of word learning. Specifically, word learning is predicted by knowing words related to the superordinate words that the child knows at the previous time point. We also have some evidence that the relationship is not due to some common cause like IQ, because we find that the relationship between hypernymy and the rate of word learning remains when you control for fluid reasoning scores. It's worth emphasizing, too, that in all these analyses, we already control for children's initial vocabulary size, which would control out the hypernymy effect if it were just that some children are better word learners in general. Our analysis can't rule out other third variables, however. So it's possible that some children are just in richer language environments, and it's just this language richness, however you define it, that is responsible for knowing these words and for learning words faster. We're also limited by the fact that these checklists provide really indirect coarse-grained representations of children's vocabulary knowledge. And so in future work, one route to showing this causal relationship in a more robust way would be by doing a training study where you experimentally manipulate which words children know. So in conclusion, our work provides one possible explanation for the kinds of variability that we see in children's word learning trajectories. That one source of this variability may be varying degrees of knowledge of these seed words or general words that facilitate vocabulary growth. Thanks.